You're listening to The Robin and Boom Show, engaging the contemporary world with the great tradition. Find us on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, or on our website at robinmarkphillips.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, here's today's co-host, Robin Phillips.
Hello, I'm so glad you've joined us today for another edition of The Robin and Boom Show. We have some exciting things for today. We are joined from Portugal with Keith Pimental. How are you, Keith?
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be on.
Hello, Jason. How are you?
Fine. Greetings from Estonia.
Well, I was wanting to talk today about something that Keith and I touched on in a phone call yesterday that we were calling methodological Machiavellianism. And we'll unpack that phrase for you. Actually, I'll let Keith unpack that for you. But kind of started when we were observing that a lot of parents with traditional Christian values are increasingly unhopeful about being able to pass those values on to the next generation. And speaking of myself as a parent of two teenagers, it can sometimes be overwhelming trying to raise our kids to stand firm for truth and virtue when it just seems like there's so many subversive influences that come at us from every direction. And one of the things we've noticed is that when parents feel pessimistic about their chances of success, the temptation can be to take shortcuts and to settle for simply getting our children to assent to the beliefs or lifestyle choices that reflect our values without actually helping them to develop the type of critical thinking and thoughtful disposition that's necessary for them to really make those values their own. So it's a lot easier to settle for the intermediate goal of just getting our children to tick the right box, to parrot back our traditional values, instead of actually inculcating within them the type of attentive and thoughtful and engaged and reflective disposition that is necessary if those values are really going to become part of who they are. And so essentially, we develop a kind of tribalism where we make the children feel that it's not okay to question the tribe, or we may use control and manipulation to shut down critical discussion. And of course, then what happens, the children go away to college and become exposed to another tribe, say something like social Marxism, and because they haven't been taught to ask questions, they just become like sheep to the slaughter. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm also hoping we can explore how this relates to political discourse, because a lot of political discourse has been tinctured by our culture of instant gratification. So the goal of an individual or a group or a party is simply to get your point across at all costs, to persuade people to adopt specific positions instead of tailoring discourse towards helping people to be more thoughtful and engaged and reflective. So, for example, we have lawmakers who actually encourage their supporters to be mindless idiots as long as they will tick the right box when they go to vote. And so, again, it's a very short-term perspective that fails to ask what ultimate goals we should be striving for as a society, as parents, and as citizens. And like I said, when Keith and I were talking about this on the phone yesterday, he used the phrase of methodological Machiavellianism. And I wonder, Keith, if you could kind of unpack that phrase for us and explain why you used it.
Well, I probably used it, Robin, because it came to me in that moment of heated intellectual passion. But Machiavelli, very few people have actually read The Prince, but he gets referenced frequently. And most people think of him as someone that tells us to be more pragmatic about our thought processes to achieve some kind of a desirable, if not even virtuous end. Well, that would be debatable about Machiavelli's actual desires. However, what he does do, and what people have taken away from that, is that the basic idea of the ends justify the means. And unfortunately for our modern society, I would argue that because we've lost a sense of the eternal, the religious eternal, and that even applies to the church by and large, we are only left with kind of the present. So a parent who's teaching their child to become a particular person, develop the good life within them, etc. The good life meaning in the Aristotelian or Platonic sense, the Socratic sense, a life examined. Instead of teaching the child that, what they really want is the child to perform, behave, appear to be a particular rendition of a good citizen that they themselves think is important, especially while that child is in their home. The problem is, I believe, that they don't give that child a perspective of longer-term consequences, nor do they have a perspective of those long-term consequences. So instead of teaching the child how to think, they teach him what to think, or at least what he should act like he's thinking while he is in their presence. And then the child goes off to college or wherever and develops his own group of people that he affiliates with. And because he doesn't have a true rudder or foundation, he goes in the direction that is most desirable. He's learned to get approval from the group, so he goes in the direction that group approves of, which could be certainly contradistinct to the values the parents were trying to inculcate. So I believe that this methodological Machiavellianism is this idea of the ends justifying the means without, though, an actual concept of the ends. They have intermediate goals that they have mistaken as being long-term or eternal goals or long-term lifetime goals. Yesterday I mentioned the idea, and we talked about the idea of, does the child, if you've done a good job as a parent, when the child dies at 80, he still has those good values that you inculcated in him. If you've done a poor job as a parent, he behaves properly while he's in your home and then may or may not follow those values when he leaves. That's not to say I'm a perfect parent. This is observation. There you go.
Jason.
Yes. And it's what you were saying, Keith, relates to what I actually had this discussion with a sales and marketing expert here in Estonia, Eric Bular. And you might not think that sales and marketing have something to do with it, but actually it does a lot. And we're talking about how do you persuade someone? And really what goes on is that someone persuades themselves. And it has to do with whether the action and affirming to a course of life or set of beliefs and values is itself a kind of an action. When someone decides to engage in course of action, it's based upon how that fits with their sense of self, of who they are. A strong sense of, this is who I am, this is my identity, this is the kind of person I am, so that's why I'm doing this. I think that in an education of a child or teenager, what's being taught has to fit within the developing sense of self. And especially in the teenage years, there's a strong sense of what is myself. They sense that there's a kind of emptiness there or lack of formation. And so they're seeking to form themselves through their peer relationships, peer approvals, and that goes on to university. So when parents are educating the kids, it has to be critical thinking, but there also has to be a sense of how do the deep parts of this education fit in with that sense of self the teenager has? And is the sense of self that the parents are helping to form, to catalyze, is that going to continue? Is it going to be long-lasting when they get to university?
And how do parents, I mean, this is it's a huge question, but how do parents form that sense of self in a way that's aligned with a true understanding of human flourishing and and virtue.
Well, it has to be aligned with the true understanding of the individual child's flourishing virtue. We have a common human nature, but how that human nature gets expressed, how it gets instantiated, is going to vary a lot with particular individuals. So, for example, suppose the parents have a son who's very artistic, not you. Although it's possible to have both. Say, for example, suppose the child is naturally a musician. He loves music. He loves playing music. His vocation in life is something to do with music. And suppose that the parents just are not in that vein, like they're more technical minded. They could give a very good technical argument for their values. It's not going to mean much to him because it doesn't fit with his vocation. So I think that parents need to have a strong sense of what is my child's vocation? What is God calling her or him to do? And you can get a sense of that from their strengths, their weaknesses, their early expressions of interests. And having a sense, there are very different modalities in how people see the world, how the way a logic or math-minded person sees things is very different from an artistically creative-minded person and many other modalities. And by the way, professionally, I teach at a high school, a preparatory school here in Estonia. So this is something that comes up a lot just with my students of how do I connect the content of these lessons with their interests, the sense of who they are. And reviewing my teaching style and successes and failures in teaching, this is something I've really concluded that I need to be aware of their vocational modalities and how what I'm teaching will fit into their growing sense of self.
Keith?
Yes. I like the direction that Jason is taking that. As someone who spent a lot of time in sales in another era of my life, it's totally correct. You don't persuade somebody. You can force people, but you don't persuade them. They persuade themselves. And your goal as a person who's trying to guide them in a particular direction is to recognize the type of person you're dealing with, the signals they're giving off, the type of cognitive facilities or faculties they use to interpret what you're saying. And a good salesperson, a good politician, a good parent, actually a good friend, a good spouse, mate, is someone who can be in tune with the person that they're talking to and say, oh, wow, okay, this is great. I'm talking about all these things in this very analytic, mathematical approach, and this person's eyes are glazed over. Okay, well, that's obviously, you may be making wonderful points, but if the person's eyes are glazed over, and the child, for instance, or even the adult, you're making no progress. So, Jason, I think that's a very good point to make, that the parent must be aware of the differences that are possible in their children, and then try to inculcate those values that they feel are important in a way that those children can resonate with. It doesn't mean the values change. I believe this is one of the things I think, though, that has been a problem, certainly on the West Coast of the United States, in the more entertainment-minded or liberal-minded mindset, of which I have some, if not a lot, familiarity. There's such an idea of the uniqueness and individuality of the child that we raise that to a level of let them be who they are, without helping them, giving them a direction as to how they can become a virtuous or good person. Because I would argue that there really is only one course there. How one walks that course may be different, but the virtuous life, as I understand it, from my philosophical perspective, doesn't allow too much significant digression from the path. So now it's just a matter of whether or not I walk it as an artist, or as a mathematician, or as a physicist, as a polymath, or as a specialist. I think that's the part. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to stop you right there, because I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that a lot of parents can they can recognize that different children walk different paths and have different inclinations, their temperament, their personality, their passions, passions in the good sense. But then take that the next step towards a kind of moral relativism, that just as a kid can choose whether to be a musician or a tech genius, so they can choose their own values and their own moral framework. Last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, the quote of the week that we had was from C.S. Lewis, Abolition of Man, where he was saying that there can never be a new value. You can't make moral values. You can only discover them and submit to them. And so do you see people going into relativism where they try to raise their children in a valueless way, as if the children can discover their own morality for themselves?
Well, I certainly see that. I mean, I don't know about Jason, but my experience, both with my own children, my grandchildren, my experience in and out of academia for 15 years, 20 years, without an underpinning foundation, which Western civilization has pretty much done away with, you don't have a lot left. You end up with a relativistic approach. And I think that I would argue that most people that kind of give a nod of respect to relativism have never thought it through. I know in philosophy, where I did a lot of my post-baccalaureate work, it was at that cusp of the age of leaving, professional philosophers anyway, had pretty much left, this would have been in the mid-90s, the idea that relativism made any cognitive or philosophical or logical sense. However, the popular culture was still embracing it. It didn't mean that those philosophers were embracing that we could know an ultimate truth either. It just meant that they acknowledged that the arguments for relativism were bankrupt. So, and were self-refuting on their face, actually. So, but the popular culture doesn't know that. And the popular culture still actually would argue very strongly for a relativistic approach. And the problem with that is you do have the children that are not taught that there are moral truths, as C.S. Lewis talked about, that you can discover. What they're taught is that, you need to be your own person. Find your own way. I'm here. No matter what you do, son, I love you without any qualifications. You're just all there is in my life. And while you may love that child that way, that's wonderful. The child needs to understand that that unqualified love does still have some certain expectations. I would argue the problem is the parents don't have any moral foundation either, though. I mean, for probably 40 or 50 years in Western civilization. I don't know, Jason, I don't know what you think about that. It would be interesting to hear, but it seems to me that the problem is not so much how the parents raise the children. It seems to me that the problem is back a generation or two where the parents don't have a moral rudder either.
Yes, on a number of these points, for example, popular opinion, popular culture being behind what's been established in academia, that's certainly the case. For example, I teach theory of knowledge, which is a kind of epistemology course in the International Baccalaureate program. And I noticed that my students will take relativism or extreme skepticism very often as a default status. And I need to spend some time just to point out the self-contradictions of a naive or extreme relativism that is simply rampant in culture. Many different causes for that. I think it's a mistake to blame it entirely on the left. This is a tendency among many of conservatives. I mean, it's promoted by consumerism. Consumerism is all about instant gratification and you are special no matter what, and all of reality is presented as a whole array of menu items or choices. That's one level. Then just another level institutionally, the way we have understood democracy in the West since 1945 has not been in terms of virtue ethics or natural law or Platonic ideas. It's been based upon a radical individualism. And this is a big issue. Philosophically and theologically, we may be able to say that moral behavior, evaluating moral behavior, is ultimately based upon standards that transcend the individual, but our whole political system is based upon an ideology of radical individualism. And it's very difficult for people to go against the political regime they're raised in. Now, of course, fundamental institutions of liberty can be interpreted and defended in terms of virtue ethics and natural law, but that's not how we have done things since World War II.
Interesting. So I live in North Idaho, in a very conservative part of the world where I'm in a small town, relatively speaking. I don't run into a lot of relativism and nihilism and skepticism. I deal more with what we might call fundamentalism, most of the families I know try to be very conservative and want to secure their children, want to anchor their children against this type of relativism that is so diffuse within our culture, at least on a popular level. And so what advice do you have to parents who fall into the trap that I mentioned earlier, where we settle for the intermediate goals of just getting our children to mindlessly toe the line, and thinking that will secure them? Then they go off to college, and then, oh well, that's not my fault because that's the fault of the world or this or that professor and so forth. How can we inculcate the good life of virtue ethics within our children, in their hearts on that unconscious level, so that it integrates into their sense of self that we're talking about?
I think there are two things, and I'll appeal to the one I spoke about just a few minutes ago, was this idea that we have lost the idea of eternity in the modern world. The modern world, and this plays into your materialism point, Jason. The modern world is all about the here and now, and what's in it for me, and do I feel good about it? Not is it good for me? Do I feel good about it? And because is it good for me is too nebulous, and it may not pay off for so long that it is irrelevant to me as the thinker, and not me personally, the person I'm speaking of. So I think this loss of any sense of us of an individual fitting into a much bigger, much larger historical perspective or viewpoint, where eternity stretches out on one side, and then my second point, history stretches back on the other side. We have also lost a sense of history on two counts, maybe three. One is most people that I meet in Western civilization, including even Western Europe, which was somewhat surprising to me, really don't have a perspective of history. They don't even know rudimentary basics of history about when things happened or what happened. I'm less interested in when something happened than I am in if they know what happened. So if we lose that and we don't teach our children how to think, and we don't think about history as a unfolding storyline that we can learn from, then as all of us here know, we are destined to repeat that storyline over and over and over, and all of its gory details. So if one looks back and sees the way that particular human events have played out due to human nature, historically, whether it's the French Revolution or Athenian republic that fell apart, or whatever it is, or Napoleon's worldview and taking over the world like Alexander and all these other people. If you don't understand what the concept there was and what the perspective is, then you can't actually put that into a formula that you can learn from. So historically speaking, we're ignorant, and even those of us that know the dates, the facts, so to speak, don't really know how to think about the facts or make them relevant to us in our own decision-making today. And then we don't have the eternal perspective, so all we're left with is the present. Hey, this feels good to me. Thanks, Mom and Dad. Glad you like it. But, that doesn't work for me. I think that's the 2 points I would make.
Okay, so would that be like communism in Russia, Keith?
Well, yeah, yeah, sure. I mean, the first question I have for most socialists, even here in Portugal, where at least some version of socialism is accepted, although I would argue the United States is far more socialist than Portugal in many respects. The idea, though, is the first thing I ask is, well, so tell me how this plays out. Because we've got a lot of examples where radical socialism, Marxist socialism, and communism have been attempted, and I don't see very many success stories. So you would think that if somebody had a perspective on this, they would look at that historical thing, and if they weren't blinded by their own prejudices, or biases, they would say, wow, maybe it's not a matter of just trying it differently. Maybe this particular worldview doesn't work in light of human nature. But I don't see that. I mean, people don't know enough about history or think that it'll be different this time, which is that definition of insanity that we all know as well. Keep doing the same thing over and over again and hope for a different result. Probably not.
Right. And in terms of this loss of a sense of eternity on the one side and history on the other, and I really like that image. That's definitely a big cause for this kind of reduction to the instant moment, to instant gratification. On the other hand, among people who are interested in history, I think that the big problem that arises is a ready acceptance of a false packaging of history that is behind the times in academia, like Keith, you were mentioning about in ethics, how even though among professional philosophers, moral relativism has fallen to some disrepute. Likewise, there are a lot of stereotypes about history which historians no longer accept, but which people do hold on to. It's very difficult for them to critique them, and these are foundation stones, or perhaps more like the prison walls of their nihilism. To give just one example, the myth of the Dark Ages, the myth that the Roman Empire fell and then everyone fell into darkness, superstition, vampires and witches, and were controlled by the church and the Pope. And then all of a sudden the Renaissance introduced the blazing light of secular humanism. Now, all of this is nonsense for historians of the Middle Ages, Renaissance, early modernity. We know that science in the West started with the church, with religion, that there was not this incessant warfare between religion and science, that there was never a complete break in learning. The Roman Empire continued to exist in some way in Byzantium. There was Assyrian Christians, there were the Persians, etc., etc. But people don't have that. They just have this prison-like structure of how the past was formed, and you juxtapose it with their neighbors who don't even know the difference between the Civil War and World War I. Or maybe even they don't even know that there were two world wars. Go ahead, do this experience. Say, we're having a celebration next week of when George Washington rode the first Tyrannosaurus Rex in his fight against Hitler. You want to come? I bet you a lot of people would say
no
yes.
question. I'm coming. I didn't know this happened, so I want to be there to see it.
And he went over the Alps into Rome.
Right. And the dinosaur was wearing that, that tri-corner Revolutionary era hat. Yeah, it was great fun.
Jason, this is, I think, one of the greatest problems. We're inundated with information. All of us, and I run into this frequently when I discuss things with people, including Robin, even my son. Everyone, I say that to Robin because he knows my son. We all think that because we can instantly get on our phone or our computer and access vast troves of information, that we actually know things. What's interesting to me is two things about that. One is that even though we can do that, it's amazing to me the number of people that don't and make such patently stupid errors about history or whatever, because it's so easy to check. How do we fall for some of these so-called false news narratives or fake news narratives, or even just memes that happen to propagate themselves through the social media? I mean, there's some of them are so easy to check and confirm as being incorrect, and we don't do it. So we think we have information. Because we think we have access to information, we actually think we know the information, and therefore we don't need to find out the information, and then we make decisions based on the information that we think we have that we don't have. This is the Rumsfeld quote, unfortunately Rumsfeld fell to his own, the unknown unknowns. I mean, none of us think we have any unknown unknowns. We all know everything. And therefore we just charge blithely into the charge that Washington's leading on a Tyrannosaurus Rex across the Alps and think that we're actually fighting a valiant fight. We're worse than Don Quixote. There's
in that case, then Keith, you've done something. You've now made me grateful for doing poorly in high school mathematics and chemistry, because it gave me a reminder that there are many things I do not know and will never know.
Well, and that's the thing that brings you. That's what we should all have. In this particular age, I wrote something down earlier to myself in this book idea that I'm kind of is nascent in my brain, and it was this idea about this, that we think we know these things. We obviously don't know them, but we are convinced we do, and we plod firmly ahead because we give credit to a specialist that acts like a generalist. So we quote, we want to talk about climate change, for instance. If somebody wants to do that, well, there are 40,000 scientists that signed this thing, and obviously this is true. I'm not going to debate climate science, but what I would say is, how many of those people who signed that are climate scientists? Just because somebody is a scientist, I mean, I would argue that moral philosophy and philosophy certainly should be in the natural sciences, although it's not. Okay, so yeah, anyway, I think that that's where we fall down now, is celebrities have a platform because they're famous. Richard Dawkins gets to talk about philosophy because he's a famous scientist. Stephen Hawking gets to talk about philosophy because he's a quantum physics theorist. And that doesn't make them people that we should be paying attention to. So to play into what you're saying there is you didn't do well in math and all that. Recognizing where we have limitations is the first step in being able to grow in our particular intellectual pursuits. If we think we have none, we don't grow. Our current president in the United States probably is one of those people that thinks he has none. And that's not to say he's stupid. It's just to say that I don't believe he thinks he has any limitations. And it's crazy.
I thought that President Trump is an expert on everything.
Well, he'll be the first to tell you so.
Yes, excellent. Well, I'm going to actually have to stop. This is a very exciting discussion, but we're going to have to stop because we're coming to the end of our time. But we will be continuing the discussion next week with these two gentlemen.
Thank you for listening to today's broadcast. The Robin and Boom Show is made possible through the generous support of listeners like you. To become a patron of the show, go to robinmarkphillips.com and select the Robin Boom Show from the drop-down menu. If you have questions you'd like to have addressed on a future episode, send us a message through our Facebook page. Once again, thanks for listening.